Alrighty, welcome back to Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator Fraggeth, and today we're going to be reading the final story in Greg Egan's Instantiation short story collection. It is the titular story, Instantiation itself, and I'll warn you ahead of time, it is a sequel to 3 Attica, which in turn is a sequel to Bit Players. So if you haven't checked those out, you may be a smidgen lost. But this is kind of, they're basically a trilogy. I don't know if there's a short story that touches on them again. Um, Mostly because he doesn't have any longer form short story collections out. He has some short story collections after this one, but they're like, each story is a bit longer, and there's usually only like 4 of them. I think there's 2 or 3 of them. Yeah. I'm looking at 2 for sure. There might be another one that I'm not seeing. I've got a nice solid Greg Egan section in just outside, just inside my field of view from where I'm sitting right now. I cannot quite read the titles though, except for Oceanic, because that's in huge font. So yeah, thank you, Greg Egan, as always, for these, and thank you, if you know I exist, for being tolerant of me reading them aloud on the great beast that is a Google-owned platform. As ever, I urge people to go out and buy Greg Egan's stuff, if you can, or really any author that I read. If there is ever an author that I read where I say don't buy their stuff, there's probably a very good reason for it. Generally, that reason is it's Peter Watts, and he's got it up on his website for free. And the odds are, if you are buying a copy of the book, it is going to be used, and he is not going to get any of it. Unless it's echopraxia, as I have run into on my own now. There's a bit of drama related to that, but not a lot of drama. Fairly straightforward. Had to upload a file separately so it counted as a video, and I got a copyright ding on it, so I had to take it down. So I took the nuclear option and took down everything but the short story prequel to it called The Kernel. At some point, I will get some sort of a framework up or network up in which I can get people those, because I do have them recorded and where I have saves of those. They're a bit bulky, needlessly bulky, I would say. And there may be other ways for me to get people access to them. The first one, definitely you'll have to download. The rest I can find a way, as it were. Anyway, without further ado, this is Instantiation. So previously on, you've had your spoiler warning, by the way. I gave you the spoiler warning before. Spoilers for 3 Attica and Bit Players. So previously on, Sagrada, that's her name, I think, traveled from different. So basically, the world, the modern future world of video games, uses basically remixed versions of people's brain personalities that have been uploaded to the internet for science as NPCs. The downside to this is that they're sentient. If they act up, they get deleted and replaced. The additional downside is that they very well know that they are in video games, because it doesn't make any sense. Because the game worlds they're in are often very silly and don't match up with the reality that they collectively have experienced in some way, shape, or form. Sagrada had a relationship with a guy, well, another recombinant NPC personality individual, whose name eludes me at the moment. Starts with an M, I'm pretty sure. Mathis. And they basically, between the events of Bit Players and Triadica, Threadica, whatever, a means has been revealed that you can leave the game world you're in and go into another game world. And Sagrada and Mathis were in search of a place that was sort of hinted to be kind of a haven for these personalities that can make the journey, called Threadica, where they basically won't be disturbed and they can just kind of sit where they are, sit pretty, and basically not worry about any interference. Um, Unfortunately, in the leap before they get to Threadica, they land in the local equivalent of Vampire the Masquerade, and unfortunately, or Victorian era Vampire the Masquerade, and unfortunately, being an NPC, non-playable character, in a in something analogous to Vampire the Masquerade, is not exactly an ideal position if you want to stay alive. It's very unfortunate for you. And sadly, Mathis bites it. He's made into a vampire, but he dies anyway, and can't come with. So, in a hurry, Sagrada and another NPC that knows that the world that he's in is fake, um, escape to Threadica, which is kind of a puzzle world, which is it's a puzzle world facade that uses different rules and laws of physics, but is covering up an enclave of I forget what they call them, recoms. What do they call their people? Anyway, they make it there, and so there are people there who are basically trying to find a way to kind of get them uploaded on the broader net. Some way of saving their lives in a more permanent fashion, because eventually the game is going to lose popularity and cease to be relevant and probably get shut down, which is bad for them, um, because then that will cause a terminal existence failure, and they wouldn't want that. Uh, so, and that's and unfortunately, the final question in the short story Threadica is, can we bring back the dead? And the answer is, at this point, no. So she cannot bring Mathis, the love of her life, back, regrettably. Um, but now we move into instantiation, and things are going to change a bit. We're going to be getting. There's actually kind of a better description of the state of affairs here than really was in the previous ones, so it's pretty good. I don't remember how much it'll cover, but anyway, let's get cracking. Instantiation by Greg Egan. Chapter 1. Sagrada watched the mayor as she approached the podium to address the gathered crowd. That the meeting had been called at such short notice already amounted to a promise of bad news, but seeing Miriam visibly struggling with the burden of whatever she was about to disclose only ramped up Segreda's sense of apprehension. Ariotville could not have been discovered, or they'd all be dead by now, but if that was a 10 on the Richter scale, there was still plenty of room for other calamities a notch or two below.
Yesterday, Miriam began, there was a 5% cut in our host's resources. To stay below the radar, we've had to scale back our own usage proportionately. That comes on top of 3% the week before. Individually, these cuts sound small and their size is not unprecedented, but what's changed is that there's been no growth in between to compensate. If the ground keeps shrinking beneath our feet this way, in a few more months we could find ourselves with nothing. Or, to put it more bluntly, we could stop finding ourselves at all.
Segreda had been aware of similar cuts in the past, but she'd never thought of them as an existential threat. When the sludge net pulled the plug on an unpopular game world, it reduced its overall lease of computing power. But then it scoured the web for another tome to gamify, and after a few misses, there'd always been a hit, bringing new customers trickling in. She'd blithely assumed it would continue that way, if not forever, at least for a decade or two.
The whole medium might not be going out of fashion, Miriam continued, but it looks as if the low-rent sector is crashing. We can see the income and expenses in real time, and the sludge net is barely making a profit now. They might be willing to slide into the red for a month or two, just to hang on to their brand in case there's a revival, but the owners have their fingers in so many pies that I doubt there'll be any sentimental attachment to this one in particular.
She sketched out the picture in more detail, summoning some unsettling graphs and charts onto the screens behind her to drive home the point. When she stopped talking, the hall was silent. Segreda could hear birdsong from the adjoining park. Over the last 2 years, the whole town had started to feel normal to her, as real and solid as any of the places where her contributors might have lived. And though she'd been haunted by the possibility that this sanctuary could vanish overnight, she'd clung to the hope that the residents' camouflage skills and the general incompetence of their unwitting landlords would be enough to keep them safe. Grace, who was sitting a couple of rows in front of Segreda, rose to her feet.
The way I see it, we have two options. We can try to steer SludgeNet out of its death spiral by offering a helping hand, give the game worlds a few surreptitious tweaks, spice up the automata. Maybe even go back to the games ourselves now and then, just puppeting the characters the way the customers do, not putting ourselves at risk.
That last suggestion brought the hall to life, with some people muttering their less than delighted responses, others shouting them.
Or,
Grace struggled to make her more palatable option heard.
we can try to migrate into the next business model. Whatever the owners do instead of the game worlds, it's still going to be automated, surely. Romance scams, investment boiler rooms. No one wastes money on human wages for that. If there's processing power being burned, there'll be a way to siphon some off for ourselves. In principle, I'm sure that's true, Miriam conceded. But if they shut down this whole operation, whatever replaces it will be a fresh installation of something entirely new. How do we migrate into that?
Grace didn't seem to have an answer, and Segreda could offer no suggestions herself. The sludge net was a vast tenement house that they'd filled with secret tunnels and hidden connecting doors, but when the site was cleared to make way for a more profitable construction, the process would be more like a nuclear strike than a bulldozer trundling through. There'd be no basements to hide in, no seeds that they could bury underground.
Or should we want to migrate into another project run by the very same sleazebags? Sam interjected. People steal computing power from other places all the time. There's some new botnet uncovered every day.
Miriam nodded.
Of course, but it's a question of scale. It's one thing to put a sliver of malware on a few thousand thermostats, but you know what it takes to run us. Sagrada had no doubt that the processing power of the planet's whole inventory of unsecured gadgets was formidable, but most of it was likely to have been commandeered already. And even if they could scrounge together enough for their own needs, a virtual world that had been sliced up and scattered between a plethora of small devices would either have to run absurdly slowly or risk betraying itself with an inexplicable rate of network traffic between the fitness tracker resting in someone's underwear drawer and the smart lighting unit on the other side of town. The hall went quiet again, but then people began talking among themselves. Miriam issued no call to order. If anything, she seemed heartened that discussions had broken out. She could hardly have expected a few exchanges with the floor to have led to a resolution. This was going to take a lot of heated arguments, and cycles of speculation and testing, before they could hope for a promising direction to emerge. Sagrada turned to her neighbor, Letitia, determined to remain optimistic while they hunted for a solution. "This shouldn't be impossible," she said. "We've done harder things." "That's true," Letitia replied. "And if a botnet won't cut it, maybe we just need to aim higher. People have hacked NASA computers, haven't they?" "I think they've even hacked—" Sagrada lowered her voice to a whisper. "The same acronym without the first A. But I was aiming high. But if I was aiming high, I'd go for those shiny new robots Lodestone are building." Letitia recoiled a little. "And what, overwrite the occupant? They already have a comp living in them." Comp as in composite. There we go. That's what they call themselves, comps. Uh, Not overwrite them. Get in first. Be that comp, not replace them. Letitia snorted. "Nice idea, but I think they're only making about 10 of those things a month. I bet there are a dozen networks running climate models that we could snuggle right into. Hurricane Ariete, latitude 200 degrees north, never hits land, never dies away." Her phone chimed. She glanced down at the screen. "So would you say you worked best under pressure?" "Why?" She held up the phone, which was running some kind of monitoring app. "While our mayor was speaking, another 4 games were shut down. The SludgeNet was never cool, but there was always a demographic who liked to slum it there. You know, ironically." Sagrada examined the list of cancelled games. No more teenage cannibal clones of Mars. No more caged zombie sluts on Heat. No more blood wraiths of the Fever Moon. No more Midnight on Baker Street. Letitia said, "When we were stuck beside those fools, we had always hoped they'd grow up and find a better way to spend their time. Now it looks as if it is finally happening." Chapter 2. Crossing the park, Sagrada saw... Oh, I forgot who Sam was, so we're going to have a quick voice change, sorry. Crossing the park, Sagrada saw Sam ahead of her, so she ran to catch up with him. "Did you know Midnight's gone?" she said. "Really?" He smiled slightly, but he seemed more dazed than delighted. "I don't know what to feel. If an ordinary person had grown up in an orphanage where the staff had made them act out a play by the Marquis de Sade 24 hours a day, would they cheer when they learned that the place had been demolished, or would they mourn the loss of their childhood home?" Sagrada squeezed his shoulder. "You still have all your friends, don't you? Do you see much of Lucy these days?" "Not really. And to be honest, I don't want to be the one who tells her. In Midnight she was the queen of the pickpockets. Dodging the occasional vampire didn't bother her, and she had more prestige than anyone else in the game. Here she's like an extra in Desperate Housewives." Sagrada felt a pang of sympathy, but Lucy was always free to build her own pastiche of Victorian London, with a cast of automata and however many volunteers she could muster. Or at least she would be, if the rest of the SludgeNet's escapees could deal with the very un-Victorian problem at hand. "I've been thinking about migration routes," she said. "All our expertise is in hacking from the inside, kicking down internal walls. We've never had to break into a system where we weren't already present." Which means we need to reskill fast, Sam concluded, since the system in which we're present is precisely what we're expecting to lose. Maybe. Or maybe that depends on how you draw the boundaries. Yeah, Sagrada said. Most networks still treat us with suspicion by default. Academic, government, commercial, they'll all demand that we log on or stop loitering if they haven't just blacklisted our IP addresses already as a well-known pile of festering crap. So why not focus on machines that expect to spend time talking to the sludgenet, and even initiate contact themselves? You want to go after the customers' VR rigs? Sam laughed. Yeah, why not? They're almost part of the system, but they stand a much better chance of surviving the sludge apocalypse without being purged and repurposed. He thought for a moment. You're not expecting them to run us, though. No, but maybe they can pave the way to something else that can. They walked over to a bench, and Sam pulled a laptop out of his coat that Sagrada suspected hadn't been there until he'd reached for it. He'd bookmarked introspection.net, Merriam's virtual server that offered views of the SludgeNet's internals to Arietville's residents. Sagrada would have chosen a less cerebral name, maybe colonoscopy.com. Sam rummaged through the data structures and found a list of all the brands and models of VR equipment that had connected to the SludgeNet in the past 6 months. There were only about 3 dozen in total, with the top 10 used by more than 90% of customers. Sagrada followed him to the same page on her phone, putting up with the small screen to avoid the unreality of magicking her own laptop onto the bench beside her. The rig's specifications were easy enough to find with an external search, and it turned out that most of them used the same chipsets. The usual approach was for the SludgeNet to generate all the graphics and other sensory channels itself, rather than delegating those tasks to the customer's hardware. Sagrada's contributors winced at the thought of wasting so much bandwidth. She was pretty sure that some of them had been into multiplayer games on networked consoles, which would have shared concise descriptions of everyone's actions while rendering the view for each player locally. But internet connections were faster now, and a rig that only needed to handle sensory data without worrying about the details of the game itself would be cheaper, simpler, and less bound to any one company's products. So basically, gaming as a streaming service is viable in this hypothetical future, is what's being said. It's not now. Right now, it is not. Anyone who tells you otherwise is either uninformed, doesn't understand the enormity of the task set forth, or is lying to you. Sorry, it's just not viable now. And it won't be for a while until major infrastructural upgrades occur. Like universal fiber optic is the bare minimum, and then you still run into serious data transfer speed issues when you're going over distance. Anyway, setting that aside, back to the book. It would also be much less vulnerable to hacking. If a chip's only role was to turn a stream of MPEG data into a pair of stereo images, there was not a lot that could go wrong, and when it did, the consequences would be strictly confined to the image processing sandbox. The more Sagrada read, the less likely it seemed that they could recruit any of these devices to their cause. It was only toward the end of the list that the prospects began to look less bleak. A small fraction of customers were using an entirely different protocol, in which the server sent them high-level descriptions of the objects in their character's virtual environment, and a local graphics card turned that into arrays of pixels for their goggles. Now that's what I call old school, Sam declared. Maybe they get a better frame rate that way, Sagrada suggested. Sam said, maybe, or maybe they're like those audiophiles who thought they needed gold-plated connectors on all their cables. But so long as it gives us a way in, I'd call it money well spent. They'd split up the list so they could each deal with half. It was Sagrada, handling the even-numbered entries, who searched for the specs for the Diamond VR 750. When the page came up, she stared at it for a while in silence before nudging Sam gently and putting a finger on the screen. Does that say what I think, or am I hallucinating? Sam took the phone from her so he could hold it closer to his face. The GPU is a Sandy Vale 9000. What's hallucinatory about that? Did you think it said Sagrada 9000? No, but you know what GPU the SludgeNet's own hardware uses? Sam smiled warily. No, I probably should, but when you smuggled me out at midnight, no one was talking about the brand name of the graphics card behind the trick. Sagrada said nothing. Sam's smile broadened, but now he didn't seem quite ready to believe it either. It was only a flaw in the SludgeNet's GPUs that had allowed them to escape from the games in which they'd woken and build a place where they could live as they chose. So what better stepping stone could there be to take them out into the wider world?
Chapter 3. Sorry. Chapter 3. What's the catch? Miriam asked. There's only one customer listed as using this model, Sagrada admitted. A man named Jared Holtzworth, and he hasn't logged on for the last 6 weeks. That's not so good. Miriam rubbed her temples. Let me guess, you want to lure him back somehow, through his friends? Exactly, Sagrada confirmed. He was in a group of 5 that used to go in together once a week, and the other 4 have stuck to the routine. So if we can give them something to talk about, maybe Jared will give the game another try. It's the same game every week? Miriam asked. Yes, Assassin's Cafe. Do you know it? Miriam shook her head. If I ever did, they've all blurred together by now. Logicians turned resistance fighters in 1930s Vienna. Oh, logicians turned resistance fighters in 1930s Vienna, Sam Precede. Sorry. Inglorious Bastards meets the biopic of Kurt Gödel that Werner Herzog never made. How are automata coping with the rules? Miriam wondered. That probably depends on which customers you asked, Sagrada replied. They're quite good at philosophical banter. They were trained using online discussions between the members of a special interest group on the Vienna Circle. But if you push them too hard on anything specific, of course they're out of their depth. And this group of 5 have been going in since before we evacuated the comps. 4 months ago, Miriam interjected, having brought up the file on her laptop. Sagrada continued, tentatively. What we were thinking is, maybe some of the evacuees who interacted with this group would be willing to go in as puppeteers and try to rekindle the old spark. I mean, there's got to be an art to expounding the virtues of logical positivism. There's got to be an art to expounding the virtues of logical positivism while garroting Nazis with piano wire, and it looks as if Jared started missing their special flair. Miriam fell silent. Sagrada supposed she was pondering the request. 4 months was not a lot of time for the former characters to recover from the shock of being plucked out of the game, even if they'd understood for much longer that it was not reality. I'm starting to think that we might have brought this on ourselves, Miriam said darkly. If people can tell when we've swapped automata for comps, is it any wonder the SludgeNet's losing customers? What choice did we have? Sam protested. If we'd waited until the automata were flawless, that might have taken decades. We did the right thing, Miriam agreed, but we should have been prepared for the aftermath. Fooling the SludgeNet was the easy part. And maybe we've even fooled the customers, to the point where they can't quite put their finger on what's missing. But the SludgeNet would have filled the games with nothing but automata themselves, if they could get away with it. We were kidding ourselves if we thought we could program our own replacements and it would make no difference. Sagrada couldn't argue with any of this, but she didn't care. They'd dug their way out of their prison cells, and if the artfully arranged pillows in their bunks could only pass a cursory nighttime inspection, so be it. They just had to get over the wall before the morning roll call, or better yet, through the main gates, if they could find the keys to the laundry van. Can we talk to the evacuees? She pressed Miriam. If they don't want to do this themselves, they might still have some advice to offer. Miriam spread her hands across the mahogany surface of her mayoral desk and gazed down at her fingers. Sagrada understood the burdens of the office, but the truth was, they all shared them now. All right, you can talk with them, Miriam decided. Just don't make it sound as if the whole town's fate is resting on their shoulders. Chapter 4. The first thing to be clear about, Moritz stressed, is that you need to throw away your history books. There are characters in the game who were never in Vienna. There are characters who died or emigrated years before. The real Moritz Schlick was assassinated in 1936, but he spread his hands and gazed down at his manifestly undamaged torso, then looked up at his guests with a smile of astonishment. Consider the books discarded, Sagrada assured him. Her contributors had only heard of a couple of the game's historical figures anyway, and what came to mind was more a rough sense of their ideas than any kind of biographical timeline. More coffee? Blanche offered, reaching for the pot. Sagrada shook her head. No thanks, Sam replied, hefting his cup to indicate that it was still half full. Sagrada had thought it would make sense to start with the convener of the Vienna Circle, Moritz Schlick, and try to get a sense of how well he was adjusting before approaching the others. But the decor in his living room was already sending her a strong message about his state of mind. The most advanced technology on display was a wind-up phonograph, sitting beside a cabinet full of shellac discs, beneath a beautifully carved wooden cuckoo clock. The man we're interested in always played Kurt Gödel, Sam explained. But then he suddenly stopped coming, not long after you and your friends left the game. Oh, sorry. That was Sam. I pay attention. The man we're interested in always played Gödel, Sam explained. But then he suddenly stopped coming, not long after you and your friends left the game. Maybe he realized he was meant to be in New Jersey with Einstein, Moritz joked. It certainly looks like I reached Princeton. With its overflowing bookshelves and old-world bric-a-brac, the house could well have belonged to a European academic exiled in America. So why shouldn't your ersatz Kurt get there too? Sagrada couldn't decide if that last remark was a complete non sequitur or some kind of dreamy logic. What we're wondering is, who do you think he would have missed the most? Once the game had less than perfect imitations of you and the others, where do you think he was most likely to have spotted the flaws? Neza, of course, Moritz replied. Okay. The name rang bells, but all Sagrada could dredge up was a general undersung genius vibe. The real Nother died in America in 1935, Moritz explained, and she had no connection with the and she had no connection with the Vienna Circle. She taught mathematics at Göttingen until the Nazis tossed her out. But in the game? In the game, she stayed in Europe, in good health, and joined the anti-fascists. And in the game, Gödel seemed quite obsessed with her. What, romantically? Moritz was taken aback. I don't think so. She was twice his age, which doesn't preclude anything, I suppose, but I didn't get the impression he was trying to charm her. Obsessed in what way, then? Was he hostile toward her? No. If anything, he seemed to prefer her company to everyone else's. But as I've said, there was nothing flirtatious about it. Maybe he just admired her work, Sagrada suggested. The real Nothers. It was an odd way to show it, but she'd encountered customers with stranger ideas. I suppose so, Moritz conceded, so I'm not sure they spent as much time discussing mathematics as that would suggest. What did they discuss? Blanche said, he was always asking her about her home life, her childhood, her own he was always asking her about her home life, her childhood, her own children.
Maybe he was just trying to get to know her as a person before they snuck off into the night to ambush Gruppenführers,
Sam joked.
Emmy had no children, Blanche replied. She told him that, but I don't think he ever stopped asking about them.
The comp who'd played Emmy Noether had renamed herself Andrea, wound back her age by several decades, and dyed her new pixie cut orange. Can you stream Netflix on that? Sagrada joked as she entered the living room, gesturing at the huge flat-screen TV. You tell me, Andrea replied. I'm still new here. All I could pick up are weird daytime soaps. Oh. Oh, it's Sagrada again. Sorry, no, we can't really do subscriptions. Even web searches made Sagrada nervous, given that there was no justification for that kind of traffic between the SludgeNet and the outside world, but binge-watching contemporary dramas would definitely fail the stealth test. We just recycle what's available within game worlds that have TVs. Andrea motioned Andrea motioned to them to sit. The couch was white vinyl, matching the carpet and Andrea's suit.
What can you tell us about your relationship with Gödel? Sam asked.
Which Gödel? There were so many I lost count.
The most recent one.
I don't think he took the game too seriously, Andrea said, and I don't think he wanted me to, either. Sagrada was shocked. You mean he tried to make you break character? Andrea frowned. Not like that. Not to get me deleted. He just kept slipping in comments that made no sense in the context of the game.
Hogan's Heroes jokes,
Sam suggested. Nah, it wasn't that crude. No anachronisms, no deliberate faux pas. But when I told him things about Emmy's life, he just refused to take them on board. And he'd ask these strange questions. Do you remember Theo? Do you remember a blue rocking horse? And when I said no, it never stopped him asking again. Do you think you might have believed that you were a customer? Sagrada wondered. Someone he knew in real life who was in the game incognito? Andrea was noncommittal.
That's not impossible, I suppose. Before they pulled us out, I thought he could have been an expert in the real world Noether, and he was just messing with me by pointing out things about her that we'd got wrong. But I looked her up just after I got out, and I don't think he was dropping references to the real woman.
Sagrada braced herself. Would you be willing to puppet Emily? Bleh. Would you be willing to puppet Emmy for a bit? See if you can get his friends to call him back into the game? Andrea laughed. Why? Sagrada sketched the situation with the graphics card, heeding Miriam's advice not to portray this as the town's only possible salvation. I suppose I could do it, Andrea said reluctantly, but I'm not sure getting the old Emmy back would really be such a thrill for this guy. Whatever he was looking for, I wasn't it. And even if the automaton was so much more disappointing for him that he gave up the search completely, it's hard to believe my mere presence would lure him out of retirement. Sagrada wasn't happy, but she was in no position to second-guess someone who'd actually met their elusive target. Do you have any other ideas? She asked. Yes, Andrea smiled. Instead of recycling the old failures, why don't you go in as Emmy? Make a break with the past and make it clear to his friends that there's now an entirely new candidate for whatever strange role he was hoping this woman could fulfill. Chapter 5 Sam paced the hallway as they waited for the council to make a decision.
Why do I feel like we're in one of those police shows where the only way to catch a serial killer is for the detective to dress up as bait?
I have no idea, Sagrada replied. Jared's never been violent to anyone in the game other than Nazi automata, which is pretty much compulsory unless you play a Nazi yourself, and he won't be able to harm me even if he wanted to. The door opened, and Miriam emerged from the council chambers. They approved it, she said, with the proviso that you do absolutely nothing that could risk a tip-off. Of course, Sagrada assured her. The fact that she was invulnerable to deletion by the sludge net would be cold comfort if she lost focus and broke character, and then a customer complaint reached human eyes that led some zealous debugger all the way to Arietville. How's your grasp of differential symmetries? Miriam must have glanced at a potted Nother biography, but been too busy to really take it in. Is it Nother, Nether, or Nother? I don't actually know, because I am not familiar with the historical figure. I should probably have looked that up beforehand. But you know me, seat of my pants. If anyone knows, feel free to tell me. Good enough for the game, Sagrada promised. Andrea gave me some lessons, but she knows these customers pretty well, and she said the last thing they'd want is to ruin their suspension of disbelief by trying to trip me up. Ha, the Emmybot doesn't understand its own theorems, isn't their idea of a fun night out. All right. Miriam still looked anxious. This is just one thing worth trying, Sagrada stressed. The chances are someone will find a back door into NOAA before we're even close to hacking Jared's rig. Maybe. Miriam exhaled heavily. Are you okay with me watching? Yes. You and Sam, and the ex-assassins, in case they have notes. But no one else, or I think I'll get stage fright. Miriam laughed. How many games did you pass through before you escaped? Almost 40. But in all those other cases, she'd mostly just gritted her teeth and played along, offering no more than the bare minimum needed to avoid deletion. This was the first time that she'd have reason to care what impression she made on any customer. Sam said, If Andrea's right, all you need to be is different from her and from the automaton that replaced her. So long as Jared's friends can see that there's a brand new Emmy in town, that ought to be enough to bring him back. Sagrada smoothed the woolen shawl around her shoulders as she approached the pale stone building. It stood on a corner block between two streets that met at a crazily acute angle. The would-be sharp corner had been sliced off to make a narrow wall that bore the entrance to the Café Central. Café Central? It's not accented, so I don't know. High above the doorway, four white statues, three women and a man in a robe, gazed serenely into the moonlight. If they were meant to be recognizable figures to the citizens of Vienna, they evoked nothing at all in her own contributors' pool of shared knowledge. When she entered the cafe, there were three German officers seated at a table straight ahead of her, looking relaxed and jovial. Her overlays marked them as automata, which lessened her urge to walk over and rip the eagle and swastika emblems off their jackets, but she still had to struggle to turn away from them, past the tables of genteelly chatting extras toward her gathered friends. Emmy! The Moritz automaton called out warmly. Sagrada smiled and approached the table, trying to act as if these people were trusted comrades for whom she would have lain down her life, and whose survival depended on maintaining the facade that their shared experiences amounted to nothing more than abstruse academic discussions and a spot of restrained carousing. Moritz pulled out a chair for her, and she greeted everyone in turn. Along with Moritz and his wife Blanche, Jared's four friends were playing their usual roles: Karl Menger, Rudolf Carnap, Alfred Tarski, and Van Quine. Tarski was Polish and Quine was American, but everyone was speaking German, with the software whispering an English translation inside Greta's skull. Three of the customers were having much the same experience as she was, speaking and hearing English, with the German as a kind of background music, but the man playing Carnap seemed to be fluid in his character's native tongue. Andrea had said she'd woken into the game as a monolingual Anglophone, like most comps, but had eventually picked up enough from the running translation to start speaking German herself. The sludgenet might have valiantly tried to convince her that German was her true first language and she was merely fluent in English, as the real Nother had been, but Sagrada didn't have to put up with any of these clumsy machinations. She dialed down the German to a faint guttural mutter, leaving her with at least some chance of understanding what remained.
I think I've found a way to generalize one of Kurt's favorite tricks,
Carnap enthused, as a waitress brought coffee and cake for Sagrada.
Suppose you have a formal language with a list of axioms and rules of deduction that capture the usual properties of the natural numbers. Any statement in this system can be converted into a number using Kurt's scheme. Its Gödel number, if you will. What I want to show is that any formula f with one free variable has a kind of fixed point. A statement g whose Gödel number, when fed into f, turns f into a statement equivalent to g.
He turned to Sagrada, as if she were the final arbiter as to whether the topic would be of interest to the gathering. That sounds intriguing, she said in her puppeteer's body, then her puppet's lips moved in sync with the translation. Carnap needed no more encouragement.
Think about the function q that takes the Gödel number of any formula, a, with one free variable, and gives you the Gödel number of that formula with the free variable replaced by the Gödel number of the original formula. If the system is powerful enough to represent that function, there will be a formula, b, with two free variables, which can be proved equivalent to asserting that the second variable equals the result of applying the function q to the first variable. Are you with me so far?
Sagrada willed him not to look her way as she struggled with the oddly convoluted construction. Why talk about this thing b instead of q itself? Ah, because q might be a perfectly well-defined function, but that didn't mean the language would let you write q times x as a x in parentheses, as a shorthand for its value at x. The language was only assumed to be strong enough to express the idea that some candidate number, y, passed a series of tests to confirm that it equaled q times x. b times x comma y couldn't tell you the answer, qx, directly, but it would tell you whether or not your guess, y, was correct. We're with you, Tarski replied impatiently.
Carnap said, remember our formula f, the target of the whole business? We use it to define a formula c with one free variable, x. C asserts that for all values of y, b holding true for x and y implies f is true for y.
Menger took a pencil from his waistcoat pocket and started making neat, sparse notes on a napkin. Sagrada thought, okay, this is the logician's way of saying what slobs like me would write as C parentheses x unparentheses is true if and only if f parentheses q parentheses x unparentheses unparentheses is true, even though the language won't let me write q parentheses x explicitly.
Now, let's feed C its own Gödel number and see where that takes us.
If you're lost, don't worry, so am I, and it probably shows. This is ever so slightly beyond my own mathematical training. Carnap took on the air of a stage... Oh, did I?
Now let's feed C its own Gödel number and see where that takes us.
Carnap took on the air of a stage magician who was about to pull a big hat out of a much smaller one.
Given what our system can prove about B and Q, it can also prove that C, fed its own Gödel number, is equivalent to F with its free variable.
I got lost in the line.
With its free variable replaced by q evaluated at c's Gödel number, and q evaluates to the Gödel number of c fed its own Gödel number. So c fed its own Gödel number is equivalent. So c fed its own Gödel number is equivalent to f fed the Gödel number of c fed its own Gödel number, and that's exactly what we wanted. G, the fixed point, is c fed its own Gödel number. Feed the Gödel number of G to F, and the result is equivalent to G itself.
Tarski leaned back in his chair and stretched his arms above his head, smiling appreciatively. That really is quite beautiful. Sagrada snuck a peek at Menger's notes to be sure that she had the whole thing clear in her head. It all sounded impossibly abstract at first, but it wasn't hard to bring it down to earth with a simple example. F might assert that the number you fed it was the sum of two integers squared. Then Carnap's argument showed that there was a statement G that could be proved equivalent to the claim that its own Gödel number was the sum of two squares. For any property the language could discuss, you could write down a statement that claimed, rightly or wrongly, that its own Gödel number had that property. And to recapture Gödel's own famous result, you'd choose F to assert that its variable was the Gödel number of a statement that could not be proved within the system. Then the corresponding G would be equivalent to the claim that G itself had no proof. So it either had to be a falsehood that the system proved, or a truth beyond the powers of the system to validate. You must tell Kurt of all this, she urged Carnap.
Kurt's still unwell,
Quine replied. Really? Sagrada frowned. I'm beginning to worry about him. I wouldn't be too concerned, Menger replied. We all know he can be a bit of a hypochondriac. Sagrada didn't push it. If she pleaded for Gödel to return to the cafe, the game might decide to fill the role with an automaton. She said, Well, in his absence, in his absence at least. Oh, God. I'm sorry. She said, Well, in his absence at least, I can confess one thing I would never admit in his presence. Tarski's smile grew impish. We're all ears. What he means is, we're your discreet confidants, Menger assured her. I'd expect discretion from my fellow transgressors, Sagrada replied, hoping she was treading the right line between jest and sincerity. Let's be honest. Who among us isn't just a little bit jealous of Kurt's achievements? To do what he did at any age, but at 25. She grimaced with mock anguish. A mere youth, leaving Russell and Hilbert awestruck? Hilbert? Carnap said,
He's not the only person I can think of whose prowess left an impression on Hilbert.
Sagrada helped. Sorry, I'm stumbling a lot today, and it's embarrassing. Sagrada had her. I can say the word puppet, I swear. There we go. Sagrada had her puppet blush a little. Professor Hilbert has been inordinate. Is it Hilbert or Hilbert? I don't actually know. I really, really need to bone back up on my name pronunciations of famous mathematicians from the early 20th century and before. My kryptonite. Thou art Greg Egan when he gets into the weeds. Professor Hilbert has been inordinately kind to me, but I can promise you that at the age of 25 I did not deserve praise from anyone. When I look back on my thesis now, I can see it was just a jungle of equations. Hundreds of invariants of ternary biquadratic forms, all scribbled out like some inky butterfly collection. There's nothing elegant in that. It was manure. This assessment seemed to leave her colleagues dumbstruck, though Sagrada was just paraphrasing the real woman's sentiments. Andrea had never said anything like this. The game had offered her no cues in that direction, and she'd been in no position to take character notes from Nother's biography.
I'm sure there are times in all of our careers that we look back on and wince, Quine said. But if I start listing all the work that you ought to look back on with pride, I'll just sound like an obsequious flatterer. Kurt's unique, there's no doubt about that, but let's be clear. You have no grounds for jealousy.
Sagrada lowered her gaze and stared into her half-eaten slice of Schwarzwälder Kirschtorte, hoping she hadn't swerved so far from Andrea's precedents that she was making the customers uncomfortable. Who wanted to go Nazi hunting with a woman who'd suddenly turned neurotically self-deprecating? Professor E did declare that my work on the symmetries of Lagrangian actions had impressed him, she conceded. She had almost spoken the Jewish name out loud in public. That really would have given her colleagues whiplash. So it's settled, Carnap declared cheerfully. No room and no need for jealousy. They toasted that with coffee. Sagrada tried not to imagine the customers' rigs squirting flavors into their mouths. Couldn't they have just conference Skyped each other, with real refreshments on hand, while they chatted about the upheavals in mathematical philosophy in the 1930s? But then they might have had to skip the next part. The logicians left the cafe and exchanged loud farewells that echoed down the empty streets, but though they set off in different directions, no one actually went far before spiraling back. Menger had sketched the routes that they should follow on the back of his napkin. Carnapian napkin. Uh, that really stopped me in my tracks. Sorry. Uh, every once in a while, something will just get me. Uh, Menger had sketched the routes that they should follow on the back of his Carnapian napkin, making the street plan look like some kind of esoteric fractal. Sagrada arrived at a corner with a view to the front of the cafe. Around 11 o'clock, the three officers emerged, and two of them departed in a staff car that had been waiting a short way down the street. The third, though, as Menger had predicted, set out on foot. Apparently he was in the habit of visiting a mistress who he could not be seen with in public, inasmuch as a claim like this had any meaning, when the game classified the man as an automaton, and there was no reason for his lover to exist at all. Sagrada heard Tarski cough quietly up ahead, so she stepped out of the shadows and started walking, 10 or 15 paces ahead of the officer. There was no one else in sight. When Tarski emerged from the alley and grabbed her roughly by the shoulders, she was tempted to ramp up her puppet's strength and just toss him aside, but she restrained herself. She grunted affrontedly as they struggled, but she did not call out for help. The last thing they wanted to do was attract witnesses. "Take my necklace," she whispered. It was the only reason she'd worn it. "I'm trying," he complained. Apparently she was putting up such a convincing fight that even though she really couldn't gouge his eyes out, he was afraid to let go of her with one hand to snatch at the jewelry. "You, sir, step away!" the officer shouted, drawing his sidearm. Tarski clung to Sagrada defiantly, and dragged her in front of him so she was shielding most of his body from direct fire. These customers hadn't ever caused Andrea serious harm, but Andrea had not been the game's first nother. The officer strode toward them, almost apoplectic at this ungentlemanly behavior. Carnap and Quine emerged from their hiding place and seized him from behind. Quine snapped his wrist and the gun dropped to the ground. As the officer cried out in pain, Carnap stuffed a handkerchief into his mouth, while Quine got a leather strap around his neck and began to tighten it. Sagrada's heart was pounding, and her puppet took its cue from her. And her puppet took its cue from her. As Tarski disentangled himself from her, he squeezed her arm in a consoling gesture. Did he care what the comp who he just thought Did he care what the comp who he thought might actually die in this encounter was feeling, or was it all just theater to him? Further down the street, Moritz and Blanche laughed loudly. Someone was coming, but it was a civilian, not a second Nazi they'd be willing to dispatch. The four of them quickly dragged the half-strangled officer into the alley, where Menger was waiting in a doorway. They followed him into a storeroom that was like an expressionist film set, full of silhouettes and shadows, lit by a single lamp on a shelf. As Sagrada squeezed past the beer barrels and dodged the cured meat hanging from the ceiling, Menger picked up a long metal skewer, and the other three men held the officer still. Menger turned to Sagrada. "Do you want to finish this yourself?" She shook her head.
Not even for your brother. The Russians might have shot him, but it was the Nazis who forced him to flee.
Sagrada took the skewer. Andrea had declined to bloody her hands, even though she'd understood not only that the Nazis here were innocent of any crime, they were also as insentient as the clockwork figurines that marched across the Ankerur. But her instinct had always been that it was not what the customers expected of her character. Sagrada looked the struggling automaton in the eye. There was nothing of a tin man about his bulging veins or the horror the software was painting on his features. So far as she knew, these particular customers had never killed a comp, but would they have cared about the difference? If she laughed in Menger's face and declared herself a Nazi spy, would they all go along with the plot twist? Or would the fact that there were no Nazis here, just a woman they'd sat talking and joking with for hours, as they all pretended to be smarter than they were, give them pause before they turned on her? She got a hold of herself. This was not the time for sub-Milgramian sociological experiments. All that mattered was Jared and his graphics card. If they wanted a new Emmy, she'd give them a new Emmy. She plunged the skewer between the automaton's ribs, granting her puppet precisely the strength it needed to succeed without faltering, ignoring the fake blood and the thing's muffled death cries. Then she stepped back and turned away. Whatever she put on her puppet's face was unlikely to convince anyone that she truly believed she was a middle-class German woman, hiding her Jewish heritage behind forged papers, who had just taken a human life for the very first time to avenge the death of her brother. If the SludgeNet had wanted Meryl Streep, they really should have been willing to pay more. Her comrades' response to the unexpectedly dark turn she'd taken was to lower their voices and tiptoe around her as they cleaned up the scene of the crime. She heard them sliding the body into a sack that Moritz and Blanche would put in the trunk of their car, to dump somewhere far away after a long drive. Customers never ended up with the tedious jobs. "Emmy," Tarski spoke tentatively from some distance behind her, "are you all right?" She turned to face him. "I'll be fine." She couldn't really make out his features, but from his body language she could have sworn he was taking the whole situation far more seriously than she was. Maybe he believed that she believed she'd just killed a man, and he felt worse about that particular deception than he did about the much larger one that made it possible in the first place. Or maybe she was overthinking it, and he was just empathizing with Emmy, as he might empathize with any fictional character, in the moment. "Will we see you back in the cafe next week?" she said. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Chapter 6. Sagrada sat on the bar stool in her kitchen, swiveling back and forth with her palms behind her on the countertop, trying not to look up at the clock. With her eyes forced to sweep the room instead, she felt herself slipping into jamais vu. Like most of the residents of Arietville who'd had better things to do than play architect, she'd just cloned a bungalow from Close to Heaven, a turn-of-the-millennium melodrama about upper-middle-class families in a fictional Californian suburb. The place had always felt a bit soulless to her, but now she was edging toward the more alarming sense that she'd woken from a drunken blackout to find that she'd broken into a wealthy neighbor's house, and was sure to be discovered at any moment. At 2 p.m. precisely, the doorbell rang. Sam had arrived to give her moral support, probably teleported straight to her porch from a bubble bath, magically dry and fully clothed because that's what the alarm he'd set had specified. She greeted him warmly anyway, and that his presence was effortless made it no less thoughtful, and that his breezy digital agility gave her vertigo made it no less honest. "No sign of the elusive Herr Godel?" Sam asked, as they walked down the hall to the dining room where Sagrada's laptop sat on the table. She shook her head. "None of them have logged on yet." She gestured for Sam to take a seat, then joined him. I hope I didn't scare them off.
By doing what they do themselves?
I'm not suggesting they're squeamish, but I might have overstepped some boundary.
It's still barely after 8 in their time zone, Sam noted.
The laptop beeped. Sagrada couldn't bring herself to look, but Sam leaned over and peered at the screen.
It seems we have Herr Menger, famous for his Menger sponge cake.
It bleeped again.
And we also have Herr Carnat, famous for his cake forkability theorem.
Stop reminding me that I haven't done my homework, Sagrada moaned. She'd been too busy writing software to find time to study up on her fellow assassin's work.
Just be grateful the game left Wittgenstein and Cambridge.
Beep.
Tarsky. Beep. Quine. Beep. G-g-g-g-g.
Sam turned and beamed at her. Sagrada grabbed the laptop and pulled it toward her so that she could see the display properly. The frontmost window showed a bird's-eye view of a man in a Homburg walking down a dimly lit street toward the cafe. It could have been anyone, but the title bar gave the character's name. The software Sagrada had set up would insert the exploit-triggering cube and the stack data mosaic into his line of sight as soon as the ambient illumination was bright enough. Jared was being fed the whole scene as a collection of objects rather than receiving a pre-computed view, but presumably his rig was generating images from the Gödel avatar's point of view, with the avatar's eyeballs tracking the players. And the SludgeNet certainly knew everything about that avatar and its eyeballs. Gödel approached the entrance, pulled the door open, and stepped into the brightness of the cafe. The event log window scrolled. The objects had been successfully inserted, and removed a few milliseconds later. Sagrada waited expectantly, but nothing followed. If the bootstrap encoded in the glimpsed mosaic had run, Jared's rig would have established a second channel into the SludgeNet and started downloading a much longer piece of software to entrench Arietville's control. But none of that had happened.
How many retries will it do automatically? How many retries will it do automatically? Sam asked.
5, at least 2 minutes apart. All at least 2 minutes apart. Too many subliminal flashes of the same objects in rapid succession, and Jared might have started to notice them. Sam shifted impatiently in his seat.
Could he have patched the graphics card's driver?
Maybe, if he kept quiet about it. There was nothing on the web about a problem with the Sandy Vale 9000, so Sagrada had assumed that only the prisoners of the SludgeNet knew about the flaw. But if Jared had stumbled on it and home-baked a remedy, why would he keep that to himself? It was hardly the key to untold riches, or even much use to an ordinary player. He would have had to spend weeks assembling the in-world objects needed to exploit it, just as Sagrada had done in her game-hopping days. The log scrolled again. Then, nothing. She said, maybe he's patched the software on his rig, not the graphics card. Everything they were doing was based on the assumption that they understood the rig's operating system well enough for the graphics card bug to interact with it in some very precise ways. It was open source software, and the rig was identifying itself as running the same version that Sagrada had worked from, but it wasn't inconceivable that he'd made a handful of small tweaks entirely for his own purposes, and switched off the version tracking that would normally have flagged that in the rebuilt final product. Gödel was at the table with his friends now, exchanging greetings. Another insertion, another null result. I should have known this guy was too good to be true, Sagrada lamented.
What does that mean? Sam protested. He has the right hardware and he's back in the game. We must be missing something, but whatever it is, we can figure it out.
As Gödel held court, Sagrada nudged the virtual spy camera so it hovered directly above the center of the table. Then she turned up the volume on the English track. I have some new results concerning the axiom of choice, Kurt declared, but we should wait for the circle to be complete before I say more. The fourth injection flickered in and out of the scene, to no effect. Sagrada could have sworn she glimpsed it herself, though from the spy cam's angle of view there was no risk of her own software being accidentally corrupted. She turned to Sam. What if he's not rendering his avatar's view? What if the whole reason he's using his own graphics card is to get a third-person perspective instead? Sam hesitated. I think some of my contributors played games where they watched their avatar from behind, rather than seeing through its eyes. That would have been in the old console, on the old consoles, not any kind of VR, and it would probably have been all jumping and fighting. The kind of fighting where you pushed a button to punch someone. He gestured at the screen. And never mind punching Nazis. How do you make your avatar behave naturally in a social setting like this? Meeting people's eyes, following their gaze, when you're not actually looking through its eyes yourself. The fifth attempt completed a perfect run of failures. Sagrada said, So either I'm wrong about the whole explanation, or there's some reason why a third-person viewpoint is more valuable to him than the quality of his own interactions with the game. Hankering for an out-of-body experience of yourself playing a Nazi-hunting Kurt Gödel seemed a bit too specific to dismiss as mere sex tape and ceiling mirror narcissism. I can't leave them waiting any longer, she's decided. But maybe I can figure out what's happening once I'm talking to him face to face. All right. Sagrada wasn't so wedded to the Ariatville illusion that she needed to don a haptic suit and a helmet. She tapped a button on the laptop screen, and she was puppeting Emmy again. This time, as she entered the cafe, she saw no uniformed soldiers. Maybe the target tonight was in plain clothes, not wearing so much as a swastika armband. Sagrada turned toward the Circle's table, wondering why the Viennese police hadn't seized on the obvious connection between the cafe's most loyal patrons and the frequency with which other diners vanished. But the young Gödel's glasses made him look so harmlessly owlish that she could almost believe he might have escaped suspicion. Gödel stood as she approached. He didn't smile, but he bowed slightly. It's good to see you, Sagrada declared. For a while there, I thought we might have lost you to your palpitations. His gaze was tracking her well enough that he did not seem disengaged or disoriented. If Jared really was watching their encounter from the side, he must have grown accustomed to observing his avatar rather than seeing through its eyes, and learned to operate it accordingly. An onlooker had access to all the same social cues. It would just be a matter of accumulating enough experience to respond automatically in spite of the odd reframing. She took a seat between Gödel and Blanche Schlick as Gödel began expounding on his latest discoveries. The Circle seemed to follow the same pattern every night. The players took turns parroting the most famous results that their characters had proved before heading off for some risk-free adventure and guilt-free violence. Sagrada tried to focus on Gödel's words. She didn't want to make a fool of herself if the group began debating the fine points of his argument. But it was hard to become engrossed in the mathematics when all she really cared about was pinning down the viewpoint that his graphics card was rendering. She reached for a small gadget like a TV remote that was strapped to her left forearm, for her eyes only, and held down one of the buttons. Her voice disengaged from the puppet. Sam? Yeah? Do you think you can inject some brief directional flashes into the scene? If his avatar's face is mimicking his own, and if his avatar's face is... Sorry, folks. Do you think you can inject some brief directional flashes into the scene? If his avatar's face is mimicking his own at all, we might see some response when we hit the right direction. Good idea. I'm on it. She released the button and re-immersed herself in Gödel's disquisition of the axiom of choice. Given any collection, finite or infinite, of non-empty sets, there is a collection of things where exactly one thing is a member of each set. That sounded obvious. Of course you could choose one word from the dictionary, starting with each letter of the alphabet, or one person from each inhabited continent. But when the collection was infinite, things were not so clear. Jared proceeded to paraphrase Godell's results concerning something he... Oh, excuse me. Jared proceeded to paraphrase Godell's results concerning something he called the constructible universe. The first level is just the empty set, and we define successive levels recursively. To build the sets in level n plus 1, we require their elements to belong to level n. But unlike von Neumann, we also require them to satisfy some formula whose other terms come from the same level. Then we take the union of these levels over all the ordinals to arrive at the constructible universe itself. Sagrada was sure that if the real Emmy had been hanging out with Godell's crowd, she would have been more than on top of this, and Andrea, after years of exposure to the material, would have followed the discussion easily enough. But as the impostor's understudy with other things on her mind, she was resigned to just nodding along and faking it. As she watched with an expression of polite fascination, she saw Godell flinch a little, as he might if a flash bulb only he could see had gone off in the middle distance. "Did you get that?" she asked Sam.
I did.
"So tell me about the viewpoint."
I'd say it was a two-shot of him and you. If this guy's actor-director, he's told his camera operator you're his co-star.
Okay. He was obsessed with Emmy, but he still wanted himself in frame beside her. Fair enough. No one shot a whole movie from one character's POV, and maybe he'd convinced himself that there was an audience for the philosopher's equivalent of esports. "Do you think we can try dropping the trigger into his field of view?"
No! Sam was horrified. We still don't know the geometry well enough. If we get half of the mosaic and half random colours from the background dumped onto the stack, we'll just crash his rig.
Sagrada knew he was right, but she couldn't face the prospect of the whole opportunity slipping away. "Let's assume he's doing all this alone. Then he must have software choosing these camera angles for him. He sets the main criteria, like you say, but he's too busy playing Godell to be micromanaging the shots."
Sounds reasonable.
"So if you can find the software he's using, we can match the camera angles." However technically proficient Jared was, it was unlikely that he'd reinvented the wheel.
Sam said, Got it. I'll let you know what I find.
As Sagrada tuned back in, Carnap and Quine were competing to see who could offer the highest praise for Godell's result. The axiom of choice could be proved in the restricted setting of his constructible universe. This didn't mean that it could be proved to hold more widely, but it did mean it could not be disproved by the standard axioms of set theory. So mathematicians were free to assume its validity if they wished, without fear of contradiction. Sagrada did her best to join the celebration. The real Emmy would have been delighted. As the afterglow began to fade, and everyone ordered fresh coffee, Menger turned his napkin over, and the true business of the night began. "Picture a finite tree, like so," he said, sketching an example that Sagrada was sure was far from random. "Some nodes are colored red, some green. Now suppose we wish to prune the greatest number of branches by removing a single green node." Sagrada waited at the entrance to the alley, bracing herself for another fake mugging. Apparently, all the Nazis in Vienna were chivalrous to a fault, and couldn't bear to see a middle-aged woman in peril without rushing to intervene, oblivious to the fact that the object of their valor would have been on the first train to Dachau if anyone had known her real identity. She heard footsteps approaching, but when the figure emerged from the shadows, it was neither their target nor her mock assailant. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" Godell asked. "Shouldn't you be—" She gestured toward the corner where he was meant to be standing lookout. "This is more important." Sagrada felt her skin prickling. What could be more important than sticking to Menger's plan to cripple the city's network of informants? Nothing could take priority over that, unless you were about to go meta and announce that it was all a game. My friends tell me you've been acting strangely, Godel continued. I don't know what you mean, Sagrada replied. I think you might be missing the old days. In Göttingen? Before that, in Erlangen? Are you sure you grew up in Erlangen? As Godel's head turned slightly, the lenses of his spectacles caught the moonlight. Do you remember the blue rocking horse? The alphabet blocks? Whatever this was meant to signify, Sagrada was afraid that if she denied it, she'd just push Jared out of the game again. I know you're confused, Godel said sadly. Or Jared, it really wasn't his character talking anymore. You admired Emmy Nether so much. I was too young to I was too young to hear that from you directly, but my mother told me after you left us. But you're not Emmy. Your real name's Sandra, and I'm your granddaughter, Alyssa. The last time you saw me, I was 3 years old. Sagrada wanted to reach for the remote so she could decouple from the puppet and start bellowing, but she restrained herself. Whatever she'd stumbled upon, Jared or Alyssa would be watching her intently now, quite possibly in Hitchcockian close-up, and the last thing she could afford to do was give away anything about her true nature. I know you'll be in danger if you say anything explicit, Alyssa conceded, but tell me honestly, do you remember the blue rocking horse? Sagrada nodded, trying to look as if she was stunned by the strangely familiar images her visitor was summoning. The sludge-net wasn't smart enough to treat this Emmy breaking character. Oh, the sludge-net wasn't smart enough to treat this as Emmy breaking character and going meta herself. She was just humoring her friend Kurt to keep him from growing too agitated before he was bundled off to the sanitarium again. And do you remember my mother, Ida? Yes, Sagrada said softly. I remember her. The moonlight picked out a faint rivulet on Godel's cheek. And her brother? Can you remember his name? Sam said, I found a good candidate for the camera software. It's popular, it's free, and when I ran it on the scene where we got a response for the flash, it gave a compatible angle. Sagrada hit the button. Use it. Whatever she said now might disappoint Alyssa and prove that she still hadn't found the Emmy she'd been looking for. But if they crashed the rig before she screwed up the encounter, there might actually be a second chance. Sam said nothing. Then he suddenly exclaimed, Fuck me dead. What? It worked! We're in! Sagrada hid her jubilation behind her brow-furrowing efforts to recall her son's name. It's on the tip of my tongue, she swore. What was it the spiritualist mediums did? Start suggesting consonants that the name of the loved one might contain and narrow it down from there? But Alyssa was in a forgiving mood. You've had a shock. I understand that. It's going to take a while for you to make sense of it all. Right now, we need to concentrate on Menger's plan. We'll talk again in a week. Godel turned and walked away into the darkness. Sagrada stood alone in the alleyway, her hands trembling. Then she heard Tarski approaching, cheerfully whistling the earworm of a tune that the zither player in the cafe had been strumming for half the night. Chapter 7. We've found her, Sagrada told Miriam. Her name is Alyssa Bowman. Her grandmother, Sandra Taub, died in 2012 and left her body to a medical school to use as they saw fit. In 2037, Alyssa got a court order compelling the Human Connectome Project to disclose that Sandra was the source of one of the brain maps they'd published 10 years earlier, and since then Alyssa's been trying various strategies to stop the data from being exploited any further. Good luck with that, Miriam grimaced. So she really just wants this woman to be allowed to rest in peace? Yeah. Sagrada could sympathize, but Alyssa's vision of her grandmother's fate was a little askew. It took the data from thousands of neural maps, each one obtained by microtoming the brain of a different individual, to build a single composite. The result was only valuable inasmuch as it possessed what the contributors had in common: common sense, common knowledge, and a collective memory of the times they'd lived through. Each individual map was far too crude to offer any hope of extracting biographical memories. It was only by combining the data in bulk that anything useful emerged at all. The SludgeNet and others who milked those open source maps for profit could churn out thousands of comps with different personalities by weighting the various contributors in the pool differently. But there were limits. If you tried to use 95% Grand Mataub and 5% other people, you really just got Grand Mataub with most of her synapses missing. And the last thing that comp was going to do was wax nostalgic about a blue rocking horse.
Sam said, "Maybe she thinks that because Sandra was such a big fan of Emmy Never, it was only a matter of time before the SludgeNet's algorithms got the casting right. Like Ingrid Bergman in Casablanca. She was born for the role."
"Or died for it," Miriam replied. "On the upside, given that the granddaughters made her case so public, we might have enough to string her along for a while."
Maybe. Sagrada didn't want to get overconfident. Sandra Taub had died in the age of social media, but she'd been born in 1957. Sam had found a family tree going back to the 1800s, and Sagrada had dug up some pictures that Ida had posted of Sandra and Alyssa in 2010, but Sandra's own parents' snaps from her childhood would be fading prints in a photo album.
Sam said, "The other upside is that we own her rig, at least until she figures out that we've played her. We've put it in a low power mode where it looks like it's shut down, and so long as she doesn't switch it off at the mains, we can use it discreetly 24/7 without much risk of her noticing. The cooling fan will only come on if it renders a game. We can do net traffic to our heart's content in perfect silence."
Miriam absorbed that.
"And you've made a second account?"
"Three more accounts," Sam corrected her. "All free ones."
I realized that,
All free ones carrying advertising, so we won't have to worry about balancing the books. The SludgeNet will think it's talking to three other customers taking shifts using the same rig. That's not going to raise any flags. Alyssa won't see anything happening under her own account. The only place this'll register will be with her overall traffic, but her internet provider only sells unlimited data plans, so there's no reason for her to monitor her usage."
"Okay."
Miriam seemed to be having trouble believing that they'd actually reached this point. For the first time ever, they could start pumping a significant amount of data out into the world, with negligible risk that any system monitoring the SludgeNet would find the traffic suspicious.
"Have you signed up for third-party storage?"
"Not yet," Sam replied. "I wasn't sure if I needed approval first."
"You have my permission,"
Miriam said. Sam punched his open palm in delight.
"In 2 weeks we could get a snapshot of Harrietville onto external servers," he estimated, "fully encrypted, and with everything stored on at least 3 different sites to be safe."
"All for free?"
"Yes. Every idiot and their dog wants you to upload your home movies to their site so they can mine the data. They'll kick you off if you send them blatant snowstorm footage that screams encrypted criminal shit. But a bit of subtler oh my god! But a bit of subtler steganography sails right through the checks."
Oh no, he did it again.
"It's only a 2-word couplet, but it really, really caught me bad."
Oh boy.
"But a bit of subtler steganography sails right through the checks."
Miriam hesitated.
"And then for $50,000 a month, we could wake the whole town again."
It was Sagrada who felt off kilter now. Spread out among the 12,000 residents, it didn't sound like much. After all, they'd once earned their keep just by playing along with the world's trashiest games.
2 weeks, she said. "So to finish the exfiltration, I need to keep Alyssa happy for one more session."
Sam said,
"Sandra's only son was called Theo. Theo. She grew up in Portland, Maine, with 2 sisters, June and Sarah, and 2 brothers, David and Christopher. If all Emmy can see around her is
Anschluss Vienna, how much 60s American pie can she be expected to serve up on cue? Will you talk to her? Sam pleaded. Maybe you can get her to change her mind. Me? Sagrada was afraid of making Lucy dig her heels in, increasing her resolve out of pure stubbornness. She respects you, Sam insisted. You were her friend for years, Sagrada countered. If she won't listen to you, why would she care what I think? I was a sidekick, a dog's body. Sam smiled, which is not to say she didn't love me like a kid brother, but the last thing she ever did in midnight was take my opinion on anything seriously. Sagrada looked around the dining room, at all the flashcards and crib notes that were meant to help her play yet another dead woman she'd never met. She needed a break from all this cramming, and if she spent half an hour with Lucy, at least there'd be a chance she was doing something worthwhile. You're coming with me, she told Sam. If her friends get their hands on me, I won't escape without a new hairstyle, 10 new outfits, and a blind date with Charlene's ex who she needs to fix up so they can both move on. Outside, the streets were almost empty. Half of the town's residents had chosen to enter hibernation together, rather than waiting until their turn came to join the queue. Sagrada welcomed their vote of confidence, and the spare processing power, which might come in handy if she needed to outthink Alyssa in a hurry. But at the same time, it was sobering to be forced to imagine her neighbors crystallizing into a form of inert and fragile cargo. Lucy had borrowed more than the design of her house from Close to Heaven. She greeted her visitors sporting the kind of body-hugging, thin-strapped leisure wear worn by most of Heaven's female characters, aimed at producing the impression that some form of strenuous exercise was constantly imminent. Each of them received an air kiss on both cheeks, followed by a tilt of the head and a kind of wail of demonstrative pleasure at their presence. All the young pickpockets from midnight had shed their shabby urchin look, but only Lucy had remodeled herself so aggressively that it felt more like a kind of satirical protest at being rescued from her wakening world and dragged into this ersatz suburbia than any kind of reclamation of her contributor's true nature. On every previous visit, Sagrada had encountered at least 3 or 4 Heavenites from the posse Lucy had joined so that they could coach her on her new identity. But today she and Sam were the only guests in sight. It looked as if the posse was on ice. Lucy got them seated and then hovered. Can I offer you brunch? No thanks, Sagrada said firmly, fighting an urge to tell her host to drop the act. Drop it and do what? Transform herself back into a prepubescent Londoner? Sam tells me you've refused to sign up for the snapshot. This is my community, Lucy replied, as affronted as a civic-minded soccer mom railing against the closure of an organic co-op. I'm not abandoning it for anything. It's all coming with you, Sagrada assured her. All your friends, all the houses, every tree on Deguilia Lane. What you actually mean is, you're going to chop this town up, scatter it among 1,000 hiding places, and hope you can piece it back together again later. Well, yes, Sagrada agreed, but not so you'd notice. I'm not leaving. Not leaving what? Sagrada scowled. The new host will start running all of Ariatville again without missing a beat. You can have the snapshot taken while you sleep, if that makes you more comfortable, or you can be frozen mid-step and the foot you raised under the sludge net's control will come smoothly to the ground when we're in freedom. The only thing we're leaving behind is a sinking ship. Not in rowboats, though, or as swimmers, Lucy countered. More like messages in bottles. Sam said, If we're going to torture the metaphors, more like messages sent in triplicate by registered post. And what if you can't gather those messages up again and breathe life into them? Then we'll all be dead, Sagrada replied. But that's a certainty if we do nothing. Lucy shook her head. It's not a certainty. If enough of us went back into the games, we could turn the whole business around. No one's going to agree to that. No one's offered them the chance, Lucy retorted. If we go back, we'll be in charge this time. No one will be able to harm us. Sagrada said, if you can believe you can whip up support for that plan, go ahead and try. But why should that stop you taking out insurance? Insurance? Can you really make that promise? Can you really make promises about those copies of our minds? About whose hands they'll fall into? Our own or no one. Our own or no one's. The encryption is unbreakable. Sagrada was hazy on the details, but she gathered that the current methods had been proved secure, even against quantum computers. Except that you or someone else has to walk out with the key. Sagrada hesitated. All right, nothing's foolproof. If someone grabs the key holder, if they're smart and persistent enough, they could figure out everything, where the snapshots are stored and how to decrypt them. But comps are a dime a dozen. Anyone looking for fresh ones can just mint their own. Lucy fell silent now, but Sagrada had no sense that she was wavering. The whole argument about the safety of the snapshots was just cover for some deeper anxiety. When we're free, you can do what you want, Sagrada promised. Here, we're all unsettled. We've barely had time to get used to life outside the games, and now the rug's being pulled out from under us. And when you can do what you like, what will you do? Lucy inquired. When you don't have to fight to escape or survive, how exactly will you pass the time? Sagrada shrugged. Reading, study, music, friends. Forever? I'm sure there'll be another fight at some point. Lucy said, in midnight, I knew who I